Imagine a king so physically broken, his own people thought he was possessed. Whispers of witchcraft followed him through the palace halls. But the real horror, it wasn't supernatural at all. Charles II of Spain, nicknamed the Bewitched, wasn't cursed by demons. He was the product of something much darker. Generations of inbreeding at the heart of Europe's most powerful royal family. This is the story of how the Habsburg dynasty's obsession with pure blood created a king who could barely eat, walk, or speak, and how their greatest mistake lit the fuse for a continent-wide war. Like this kind of history. Hit subscribe. It gets worse. When foreign ambassadors first met Charles II, many couldn't hide their reaction. This was the king of one of the most powerful empires on earth, and he looked like something out of a nightmare. Charles couldn't close his mouth. His lower jaw jutted out so far that his lips couldn't meet. His teeth didn't align at all. The top row sat completely behind the bottom, leaving a permanent gap you could slide a coin through. This wasn't a one-off birth defect. It was the visible outcome of centuries of calculated incest. The Habsburgs had a rule: marry inside the family, keep the power close. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces. By the time Charles was born, his family tree wasn't a tree, it was a knot. His parents, uncle and niece. His grandparents, also uncle and niece on both sides. Genetically, Charles had less diversity than someone raised on an isolated island for generations. The result was what we now call mandibular prognathism, but back then people just called it the Habsburg jaw. And it wasn't just ugly, it was debilitating. Charles couldn't chew solid food. Everything had to be pured, mashed, or liquefied. Soup dripped from the corners of his mouth. Servants stood by at every meal to wipe away saliva and bits of food. Dinners weren't displays of royal grandeur. They were carefully managed train wrecks. Even worse, his speech was almost impossible to understand. His mouth structure turned every sentence into a slurred, garbled mess. At night, his mother feared he might choke to death on his own tongue. And through all of it, the royal family knew exactly what was happening. Their obsession with keeping the bloodline pure was backfiring in real time, but they didn't stop. Power came first. Charles was just the collateral damage. The jaw was just the beginning. Charles II's entire body was a mess, a collection of parts that didn't seem like they belonged together. At 35, he looked like a frail child who'd been stretched and bent by some cruel force. He stood barely 5 feet tall. His limbs were stick-thin. His torso was short and hunched. His head? Massive, oversized, and constantly wobbling on a neck too weak to hold it straight. And it wasn't just physical. Mentally, Charles functioned more like a child than a ruler. He didn't learn to read until he was 10. Even then, he could barely follow what he read. Tutors described him as a broken vessel. Information went in, but nothing stuck. He threw tantrums over minor issues, screamed, cried, then hours of silence, just sitting and staring into space like nothing was there. The King of Spain, lost in his own head. The king wasn't just cursed, he was dying from the inside out. In a royal family, you have one job: continue the dynasty. Charles II couldn't even do that. He married twice. Both marriages failed in the same humiliating way. No children, no heirs, no future. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, was a young French princess expecting a powerful king. What she got was a man who looked and functioned like a sick, confused child. On their wedding night, she reportedly burst into tears. Servants said Charles looked distraught and bewildered, unsure of what was expected of him. The truth was brutal. Charles's body hadn't developed enough for sex, let alone fatherhood. His reproductive organs were so underdeveloped that royal physicians called them infantile. Biologically, he was closer to a prepubescent boy than a grown man. But no one could admit that, not in public. Instead, the court turned on Marie-Louise. They blamed her for being barren. She was forced to undergo invasive, humiliating medical procedures. She drank bitter herbal tonics, endured painful treatments, was poked, prodded, and prayed over. All in a desperate attempt to fix something that wasn't her fault. The stress broke her. Once lively and intelligent, Marie-Louise became withdrawn, depressed. She spent her days praying for a miracle that never came. When she died suddenly at 26, whispers of poison and treatment complications spread through the palace. Charles remarried almost immediately, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg. But the outcome was even worse. By then, Charles was in his 30s, and his body was falling apart. Maria Anna reportedly wrote letters describing her horror at her husband's condition and the growing realization that bearing a child with him was impossible. Doctors were called. Foreign specialists consulted. Old fertility texts were dusted off. At one point, they even tried magical remedies. Nothing worked, because the issue wasn't spiritual, it was biological. When medicine failed, the Spanish court turned to something older and far more desperate. They called in the exorcists. Charles II's condition was so bizarre, so untreatable, that priests became convinced he wasn't just sick, he was possessed. The diagnosis: multiple demons had taken up residence in the king's body, placed there by witchcraft. What followed was less science, more spectacle. These weren't private rituals done quietly in a chapel. They were full-blown ceremonies held in the throne room. Nobles and foreign diplomats were forced to watch as priests shouted Latin incantations over the king's twitching body. Holy water was splashed, crucifixes pressed against his skin until he screamed. Sometimes he vomited, sometimes he passed out, and every time the priests claimed it was the demons resisting. Charles believed them. In 1699, after a series of brutal exorcisms, Father Diaz claimed he had expelled 47 demons from the king's body. Each one was supposedly responsible for a different part of his suffering. Charles was so drained he collapsed and didn't speak for 3 days. Charles II died in 1700 at just 38 years old, a miracle considering how broken his body truly was. But no one was prepared for what the autopsy revealed. His heart was described as no larger than a walnut, blackened, shriveled, barely able to pump blood. His lungs were rotting, full of fluid and gangrene. Then came the final horror: his skull. When doctors opened it, they found his brain surrounded by excess fluid, what we now know as hydrocephalus. The brain tissue itself was discolored and damaged. It explained his mental delays, his mood swings, his inability to function. He had been neurologically impaired from birth. The royal physician summed it up in one sentence: "It is a miracle this body sustained life for so long." For centuries, the Habsburgs had carefully engineered their bloodline, marrying cousin to cousin, niece to uncle, believing that concentrated blood meant concentrated power. But in the end, that obsession didn't strengthen their legacy. It destroyed it from within. Charles wasn't just a tragic figure, he was a warning. A living experiment in what happens when politics, pride, and power ignore the limits of nature. The royal family tried to outsmart biology, and biology won. He didn't die in battle, he wasn't overthrown, he wasn't assassinated, he simply fell apart. Charles II wasn't cursed by demons, he was cursed by a system that valued bloodlines over biology, legacy over life. His reign marked the slow-motion collapse of a dynasty that thought it could cheat nature. In the end, the very thing the Habsburgs tried to preserve, their pure royal line, is what destroyed them. Because sometimes the deadliest threat to a kingdom isn't war or rebellion, it's heredity.